All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to do our final session. Final session, if you could be seated and end the conversations, we sure would appreciate it. We're going to talk about the global perspective, how to build sustainable communities. Everybody, if you could please be seated or take your conversations outside, that's fine too. It's the last of our Meet the Innovators sessions today, the 2022 Edison Award Meet the Innovators session. I've had a great day. It's been fabulous. I've learned a lot. I've been taking notes? Yeah. This is good. And you'll be able to see it on YouTube. It's been streaming out. You can review later, and in case you forgot some stuff, because there's a lot of stuff. It's like kind of tumbling around in my brain here. So let's talk about the world is headed to zero carbon, or so we hope. If it's not zero carbon, we're all toast, quite literally. So it's happening on a lot of fronts, and it's happening very quickly. And that's good news. And so it's also happening in places where you might not necessarily predict it. Like if you were thinking about a zero carbon world, would you call up a real estate developer? Or would you call up the guy who works for a big petrochemical company? Or for that matter, venture capitalists? Are they that interested in this kind of stuff? As it turns out, they all are. We have three of them right here who are going to tell us a lot about where the smart money is headed right now in making the planet more sustainable when we're faced with, after all, what amounts to an existential crisis. We have Sig Kitson, who is the chairman and CEO of Kitson & Partners, the developer of Babcock Ranch. If you haven't gone out there, you have the opportunity to do that while you're here. It is a solar-powered community, but it is sustainable on several other levels, which we'll get into in just a few moments. We have Bob Mahan, who is the Executive Vice President of Sustainability, Technology, and Innovation, and the CTO and the CSO at SABIC, which is a big petrochemical company. You're a busy guy. You got a lot of titles there. And finally, Diana Zhu, who is with Eclipse Ventures, looking at all kinds of Zhao, I'm sorry, did I say Zhu? Zhao, who is with Eclipse Ventures, looking at all kinds of sustainable investment ideas in the VC world. And I'm going to begin with you, Sid, because last year we would have been sitting actually under your gazebo at this moment. We're here today inside, and that's fine too. It was kind of a nice setting out there, I got to admit. You have had a busy year. The idea of Babcock Ranch, to the uninitiated, is, well, why don't you give them the short story on what it is? You took a big swath of what was a ranch, set aside a ton of it, and it built a community which is really like no other.
That's right. We purchased 91,000 acres. It's 143 square miles. And then we sold 73,000 acres back to the state of Florida in the largest land purchase in the history of the state. We ended up with 18,000 acres, and out of the 18,000 acres, we're preserving half of that. So at the end of the day, 90% of that original ranch is in preservation forever, and I think that's probably what we're most proud of. But what we wanted to do then was create the most sustainable, the most environmentally responsible new city that's ever been built. We have entitlements for just under 20,000 homes and about 6 million square feet of commercial and retail space. And our mission has been to prove that people can live in an environment and that it's economically viable. And that's the key, that we can live with nature and we can do it the right way, that people want to live there, and that you can actually make money doing it. Because if that's the case, then the private sector is going to step up and really become a part of it.
It's always good to hear when the environment accrues to the bottom line in a positive way. So just give us a sense of how quickly you've grown just in this past year. It's pretty brisk business.
You know, we're very proud of the sales. It's kind of nationwide, but I think Babcock in particular has done very, very well. We're selling well over 20 homes a week. And have been very consistent with that throughout the year. We were ranked 14th in the nation last year. I think this year we'll be in the top 10, and very, very proud of that. Again, if you look at, we ran a survey just recently, and the take rate on the survey was over 80% of the people participated. And one of the questions is why are you moving to Babcock Ranch? And the number one reason was outdoor living. The second reason was sustainability, and I put those two together. So people are moving there because of what it's become, because it celebrates the environment and it's sustainable.
So the market is speaking to you there. And when you say sustainability, most of the time, I think we think about energy. We think about solar panels and wind turbines, but you have a more of a holistic approach.
We do. Energy is very important. We're the first solar-powered town in America. We have 150 megawatts that power our town directly. That's 700,000 panels on about 840 acres. And we have an observation tower and are constructing now an education center so people can actually see this and experience it. It's really very, very remarkable, and we're very proud of that. But sustainability goes far beyond that. And most people think of it just purely from an environmental perspective, which is important to us. We have this incredible water quality system, as an example, that I don't think anybody else has ever done. We put a series of weirs in place that completely rehydrated an entire wetland. Incredible, by the way. Just so everybody knows, we're okay, because if we do something now, the earth heals itself so much faster than you can. Mother Nature is very powerful, and we have proof of that in our own community. But also, we think education is important. We have, we think, is one of the best school systems in the state at Babcock Ranch. It's a project-based learning, and we're building a new high school, brand new high school there. And these kids not only learn through doing, but they're learning about the place. So if we start at that age, that's how you really get them to, later on to understand what sustainability, environmental responsibilities, and all the things that go along with it. So that's part of that definition of sustainability.
So making sustainable humans is a part of the whole plan here, right?
We have to train the people, no question about it.
So the school is actually a center part of this, and that's become a real draw. Was that because frankly, most big developments in Florida are kind of monoculture kind of things, if you know what I mean. People with the amount of gray hair I have and beyond. And that doesn't necessarily make a vibrant community, does it?
No, I think, first of all, two things. One is we wanted it to be multi-generational. I didn't want a bunch of old people, like, no offense, you and me.
Yeah, I'm with you.
And it worked, because we over half the people moving there are young people. But the other thing we did was we feature the school. Where most, I think, developers take the school and put it in a place that might be, off the beaten path. It's right smack dab in the center of town. So when you drive through Babcock Ranch, you cannot miss our complex. And the school that we have there that we're very proud of. It's interesting to hear what Byron was saying about how education was so important to him, and that's a great message, because in our mind, not only pre-K and then K through 12, but whatever form of education after that you take, we think is very, very important.
So Bob, let's talk. Last year we talked a lot about recycling of plastics, and at that time, you were talking about a similar thing. There was a market push to you, and it was changing the way the petrochemical business was thinking about plastics, just as perhaps other developers are starting to follow SID. I'm curious, this year I'd like to focus a little more on what it takes to make the plastic and the carbon footprint that is required to get the plastics to us. Is it possible for a petrochemical company to imagine approaching net zero, given what you do?
Great question. And to be very clear, yes, it's not only possible. I mean, we've announced, as many of our peers have as well, a path to carbon neutrality. If you look at, and I think we've discussed some of this before, but if you think about, what it takes to make our materials, and you think about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, which you'll hear us talk about through the session. Scope 1 is the emissions you make, from your direct operations and your assets. And, for us, I think what's not known about the industry is that 85% of those emissions come from heat used to drive reactions, right? It's heat used to transform. It's not wasted in byproducts or other materials. It's actually used just in driving the thermodynamics of those processes. So you have to think about, what can I do in a world to generate steam, to generate heat, to drive these reactions with a low carbon footprint? And there are incredible ways to go address that problem. If you look at our roadmap, it starts with improving the reliability of your operations. I mean, that's sort of step one. And we think 20% of our emissions can be improved just by investing in new technology, digitalization, other things that can enable us to operate more efficiently and more effectively. The next part is through renewable energy, with massive investments on our side and in the industry on sourcing our electricity from renewable sources, because scope 2 emissions are just a direct result of your purchased energy supply. And then you look at, how do I get that heat driven by other materials, other solutions, and it's going to come from a combination of electrifying assets, so moving away from methane, which is used typically to fire burners, to fire boilers, to fire furnaces, and using electricity to do that. And then it's going to come from using other heat sources like hydrogen as a way to drive those reactions. So, from our world, we have a clear path towards addressing the challenge. It's going to require investment in renewable energy supply. It's going to require new technologies to drive the redesigns of boilers, of furnaces, of other unit operations. And it's going to require investment, right? Investment in large-scale technologies like carbon capture, like the production of blue, and more importantly, I think long-term green hydrogen is a key source for us. So we see a clear path to do it. We're invested to go make that happen, and we've made our commitments externally known. But it's going to require a whole different level of collaboration across sectors that we're not used to collaborating with. Collaboration within the industry and our normal value chain operates very well. But if you look at where we have to go in the future, it's how do you collaborate with the electricity supply side? How do you engage with regulators in parts of the industry you're not comfortable with? How do you deal with, we talked about plastic waste last year, but how do you deal with the waste side of the equation? Because a big part of our carbon emissions are going to come from the end of life of the plastics that we produce and chemicals. So how do you integrate new parts to your value chain and collaborate with new entities that you're not used to collaborating with?
Of course, the plastics themselves are petrochemicals. What about that? Are you looking at alternatives there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the key is to make sure that you provide a material that meets the needs of the consumer, that provides the performance benefits of plastics in terms of lightweighting, durability, processability, but you can do so with a lower carbon footprint. So, from our side, the initial thing that we've done is launch a whole series of bio-based materials that are based on bringing bio-feedstocks into our existing assets. So it was something that we could do quickly because we could use the existing infrastructure. And so using materials like tall oils and waste oils, you can feed those into our existing assets, and you can make a whole host of materials that are still the same chemical composition, which means you don't sacrifice any performance, but you do it from a bio-based source. But at the same time, we look at other routes to new materials that are based on renewable materials. The key is always, though, balancing. You've got to still deliver the performance benefit. If the reason you use a plastic is because it provides that lightweighting, it provides that performance, that protection, and at a competitive cost. You've got to make sure you can manage that with these new solutions, and you also have to think about the waste infrastructure and how do you not complicate that in a way that makes recycling more of a challenge. So those are all the things that have to go into that thought process.
So I think overall plastics are about 8% of the carbon pie. Does that sound right to you? Is that the right number?
Yeah, if you think about the split, so the industrial sector is around a quarter of the carbon emissions. And in that industrial sector, that's primarily, if you think about it, it's chemicals and plastics, it's steel, and it's cement.
Steel and cement are the biggies, right?
Yeah,
But
and if you look at, but kind of an interesting point on that, and I think that gets lost in some cases, is that the largest energy demand group of those three is chemicals and plastics. So we're the largest consumer of oil and gas. But at the same time, we're the lowest carbon emitter. And now why is that? Well, it's because half of the feedstock that goes into the final product at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, if you look at, I'm going to go away from plastics, because of this plastic waste issue. I'm going to go back to steel or other materials or glass. You end up sacrificing overall efficiency of carbon neutrality, right? So this is why these things are so complicated and so interconnected.
so can we think about plastics as a carbon sink in a way? I mean,
That is what they are, right?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, you're making a choice to put half of the energy in to drive the reaction, and half of it ends up in the product. And so in a way, that's really carbon capture and storage. But at the end of the day, we have to make sure, and again, as we discussed on the waste issue, that we view that end product not as waste, but as a valuable feedstock that's full of valuable carbon, right? And how do I reuse that in my system to make sure that there's no waste?
so should we be thinking about, when you talk about recycling plastics, should we be thinking about it as recycling carbon as much as anything?
That's how I think about it. And at the end of the day, one of the challenges, as a society that we have or have had, is that we view those things as waste, right? I mean, if at the end of the day there's more value for the waste management companies to landfill those products than it is to recycle them, you're not going to drive the right behaviors. But when you recognize that it is a valuable resource from a finite supply of feedstock, and I can use the value in that to regenerate new materials, I think it changes your thinking about how we should value the products.
Well, given the challenges of recycling, does it make more sense to just make sure we handle the waste in a way that doesn't put it in the oceans or beside rivers? In other words, let's put it in landfills and leave it there and think of it that way. Or, because, I mean, we were talking last year about some of these packages that have 21 layers of different kinds of plastic formulations. The recycling challenge there is tremendous. And it might, in the end, have a greater carbon impact ultimately than just putting it in a landfill and make sure it doesn't end up in a dolphin.
Yeah, my view of that is, I mean, certainly you could view it as a carbon sink, and you could view it as landfill as an option. To me, that's not the right solution, right? To me, those materials have inherent value, and burying it in the ground is not necessarily the ideal solution to that problem.
Doesn't sound great.
No, so I think to your point on packages, I mean, you have options like mechanical recycling, now advanced recycling solutions, which allow you to address some of these more complex structures. To me, those sorts of approaches are a way better solution in addressing the problem. Utilizing that carbon as many times as you can use it is a better solution than burying it. It doesn't mean that there are not going to be scenarios where there's a challenge, but I think the more that we focus on how do we maximize the value of a waste stream, taking all components and maximizing the value we get out from reusing those materials, we're going to have better solutions. And one last point, I think we've over-designed products for the applications that we serve them with, right? I think the other thing that has to happen is to say, do I always need a 7-layer package for a solution? Do I always need a mixed material solution? And go back and start with, design for recycling at your starting point with a customer and within the value chain. How do I need to use this product? How long does it need to be on the shelf? Why do I want it to have a finite lifetime? Can I think of more durable solutions? Design those up front. I mean, our society has become so accustomed to the low cost of these solutions that they have over-designed features, right? But I think at the end of the day, it's created a culture that then accepts that waste is a part of what we do. And I think the more we think about redesign at the beginning, I think we can have a huge impact on that.
It's just too cheap, right? I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah,
But I know you're going to get in trouble if you say raise the price. It'll be your last day with SABIC right here. Anyway, all right. So Diana, are you hearing some business opportunities here?
Oh yeah, I'm taking notes.
We were talking with Carmichael earlier, and he's talking about this hockey stick of money that is coming to these tough tech problems, these green tech issues. What is driving that, do you think?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I mean, I think it's really interesting to note that, first of all, that there is kind of more and more investments in things that are sustainable and things that are green. And I think there's a couple of reasons why this is coming to light right now. One is, if anything, the pandemic has had a silver lining, which is that people have started to have more time to think and to reflect about their lives, their own mortalities, and what kind of world do they want to leave behind for their children and for future generations. And I think there's this kind of awareness that, what are we doing right now? We're all mortal, and what can we do to improve the future? And I think people are starting to become more interested in creating a world that is better for future generations. And so that's one thing. The second thing is you are really starting to see a lot of government intervention in this, which I think in this case has been a really good thing. So for example, President Biden's climate change policy, he's been pushing climate change really heavily, getting to net zero by 2050. And a lot of the policies coming out of that have been really instrumental in moving the needle forward on this. In California, there is a new regulation that says that you will not be allowed to buy any non-electric or non-internal combustion engine cars after 2035. So when you take into account the fact that transportation accounts for almost 30% of greenhouse gas emissions in the state of California, that is a huge opportunity across the board to get an entire industry to be able to meet those kinds of standards and regulations. On top of that, you've got automakers like Ford and GM coming out and saying that they're going to go completely electric and go to net zero by 2040 or 2050. This is a really real thing. I think in a way that it hasn't really been real, maybe even 5 years ago. I think in the last year or two, this has become really, really real. And with these huge opportunities and these regulations that are coming down the pipeline, I think there's a massive opportunity to invest in this space. And that's why a lot of VCs like Eclipse Ventures, like Breakthrough Energy Ventures, they're all investing in this space because not just because of course it's wonderful to have a more sustainable future, but really there is a business opportunity in this space.
Well, thank you, California, once again, for saving the planet. What would we do without good old California, right? So it does raise a question, though. How much of this could happen on its own with the free market without any government intervention?
I mean, it's a good question. I think, one of the things that I didn't mention as one of the reasons why there's a shift in this is consumer sentiment. And I think this would happen eventually. I think government regulation has sped this along. But really, a lot of people that we talk to, employees, founders, entrepreneurs, they are really, really interested in solving these hard problems. A lot of times, climate change and sustainability are parts of the problems that they want to solve. And so I think naturally you're seeing that it's no longer enough to have a job that pays the bills, that people are doing work. They want to make sure that the work that they're doing has some kind of impact. And so I think you'll see it eventually because at the end of the day, it's all about hiring a good team, hiring the right people to make your business successful.
But if there was a predictable way to somehow put a price on carbon, how much would things fall into place faster?
I think things would fall into place fairly fast if you had some kind of price on carbon. But I don't think that's the end. I think there needs to be a way to measure emissions, which I think is a big issue right now. A lot of times companies or people don't even know how much they're emitting. I mean, that's first of all, the biggest issue. I mean, kind of what you were talking about with Scope 1, Scope 2, and even Scope 3 emissions, those things are very difficult to measure. And only now are companies really starting to be actively thinking about, how do I measure this? How do I track this? How do I make sure that I'm actually contributing towards my net zero goals? Net zero is a great thing to talk about, but ultimately, if you're not finding a way to track what you're actually producing, how do you actually get there? And so I think that's really the first step.
So Scope 3 gets really complicated, doesn't it, Bob? And this is basically, you're trying to measure the carbon impact of the products that you've released to the world. I wonder, frankly, a lot of your products, you make wind turbines, not you personally, but Tesla cars. There's a lot of plastic in there. Yeah. Should you get a credit for that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, right? And I think this has been a discussion that's actually gone on for a long time. Is like, do you take credit for product benefits, right? Yeah. I mean, I think to me, my view of that. I mean, obviously, I think companies should take the advantage of branding what they're doing and that it's helping to enable the solutions. But to me, being very disciplined on Scope 1, 2, and 3, and being clear that you're actually reducing yourself and what's in your control and the things that you influence should be the first job of all of us, right? So making sure, I think great point you made on making sure that on our Scope 1 emissions that we have very good tracking within our assets of what we're doing, where the emissions are coming from, and how do we drive reductions. And Scope 2, right, driving the change in the renewable energy supply, right, which requires obviously economics to make that work, but also government intervention, right? We need to scale renewable energy supply at a level that's unheard of, over the next several decades. And on Scope 3, so if you think about Scope 3, and it sounds like a complicated topic, and depending on where you sit in the value chain, it is, because everybody's Scope 3 is somebody else's Scope 1 or emissions. But the reality is, for us, and I can use that as an example, the feedstocks coming in, the emissions for those, that's one part of that's about 20%. The end of life of the materials that we make, that's another 20. And back to your point, hopefully that end of life is something that is durable and lasts and drives reduction of emissions for others. But also the energy that our customers use to process those materials is part of that emission. Our supply chains are part of it, which you want to drive reductions there because you want to make sure that shipping, marine fuels, that other transport shift to more sustainable solutions. So to me, product benefits is something we should talk about, and we should be driving towards solutions that can enable product benefits that reduce emissions. But to me, it's very important as a priority that our focus is on tracking what we actually do within our control and within the value chain that we control to reduce those emissions.
So Sid, obviously you don't do scope 3 calculations when you build a house and a development, but I do wonder how many developers are seeing what you're doing and following in your footsteps, and to what extent could that happen naturally? I mean, obviously building developments is not a turn on a dime thing, but could there be ways that regulations or zoning or you name it could encourage the kind of development that you've created, which we've discovered people will snap up in an instant?
I think certainly policy always has an impact. So I don't think there's any question about that. But I think the number one issue is can it be economically viable? And if it is, I think you are seeing more developers do this across the country. We've certainly received an incredible number of calls and inquiries from other developers around the country, around the world, saying, "Hey, can you help us with this? How did you actually do what you've done?" And it's interesting hearing this conversation, because if you talk about electric vehicles, being carbon neutral or leading to carbon neutrality, well, that's only if, in fact, the electricity that's powering that car is carbon neutral. So, and I would argue that California isn't even close to being there. As a matter of fact, they have
shutting down their nukes.
That's right. They have severe problems where, what we try to do with our solar energy is say, look, if you do power, your car, particularly during the day, it's pure solar energy, and that gets you to closer to that carbon neutrality. But the other thing too for us is, and again, leading off of this conversation is, the one thing that we want to take a next step on is the actual homes themselves. So we're building an infrastructure that is very sustainable, environmentally responsible, but the homes themselves need to take another leap forward. We have what's called Innovation Way at Babcock Ranch, where 3 of the largest builders, can you believe it? 3 builders, the largest builders, actually work together. I mean, when does that ever happen? It's like getting the Democrats and Republicans to work together. It's not likely. Hopefully it'll happen sometime. But so they got together, and they're showcasing this new technology that isn't, most of it not out into the marketplace yet. And that's what we need to do. We're looking at Innovation Way 2 that could be, well, not could be, we're discussing doing 3D printed homes. And what does that mean? And how sustainable is that? How can we measure that? It's the measurement that you're talking about that's so important. So, when you look at 3D printed homes, okay, but the concrete, is that really sustainable? How much carbon does that create? And is there a way to have these materials be better for the environment? And that's all part of that whole picture that we're working on.
What incentives would a developer like you get for building what you build? Or is that just the market has rewarded you and that's enough?
That's enough. We don't have government subsidies or anything like that.
Should there be something like that to encourage developers to make moves like this, or will it happen inevitably?
I don't think it's necessary. I think as long as people come together and say, this is how I want to live, and they're willing to buy that product, and it's not more expensive. That's a myth. To do it right is not more expensive. You just need to do it right from the beginning. I think that's enough. I think people really, and people are now starting to pay more for new technologies within their house, kind of some of the cool stuff that everybody's been talking about. But I don't believe that you need huge government subsidies to make this work.
Can the heat pump and the induction stove save the planet? I mean, if we electrify homes, that's a big bite, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But what you'll see in some of these innovation homes are some incredibly unique HVAC systems that do a much better job dispersing the air throughout the house. And it saves tremendously on your bill, because how many people here, even in your offices, one part of the building is freezing cold and the other, everybody's sweating. Or if you're in your house, the imbalance from one room to the next, whereas these new systems do a much better job of regulating that that airflow, and you can have much more control from room to room, and that alone will save quite a bit on energy costs and gas costs.
Now, I know when you started out, you imagined autonomous shuttles sending people around Babcock Ranch, and that didn't pan out so well. What happened there, and what are the pitfalls when we start thinking about driving towards zero in transportation?
We're big believers in autonomous vehicles and have been. So we had an autonomous shuttle out, and because we wanted to test it and learn from it. And what we learned is it needs to go faster than 5 miles an hour. When you have
you can walk faster, it's not going to work.
When you have a gopher tortoise beating you to the spot, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And so that was
market spoke on that.
Market spoke on that one.
Yeah.
Needs to be faster and more efficient. And so we did learn a lot. We learned a lot. People thought it was more of a novelty at first, but we want it to be more of a business model. What we want to prove is that people won't need more than one car in their garage within 10 years. But it's, I don't think anybody realizes this, but it's happening. Autonomy is happening. Look at the cars. They're slowly introducing these features in your car when you see the commercials where they're driving along the highway and they start clapping or that kind of thing. So there is autonomy in the cars already, and they're slowly introducing that to the public so they get used to it. But we believe in full autonomy. Yes, we are working with several companies to introduce it, both point to point and the shuttle vehicles and it's both. The shuttles, I think, can be very, very helpful, as well as somebody being able to call a car and having them take it to the airport on an individual car.
Or an eVTOL. So, Diana, as you look at driving towards zero in transportation, I know you had some experience with the Hyperloop project, and there were some challenges there, frankly, in reimagining how you get people from point A to point B. Is this paradigm we have right now, which is kind of replace the fossil fuel family car with an electric version, is that going to be the be-all and the end-all, or is there something else out there that, as you look as a VC, that you want to put your money on?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because when people think about the future of transportation, it's electric, it's autonomous, but we still want to use our modes of transportation the same way that we do today. So we still want to use a car in the same way that we want to do today. And I think, everything is becoming electrified. Cars are becoming more electrified. But there are a lot of challenges with electric vehicles as well. One being that batteries are really heavy. And so what that means is that oftentimes you're range limited, or you can't move certain payload sizes. And so when you think about using an electric vehicle in the same way that you'd want to use a traditional vehicle, you may not be able to do that. But maybe that's okay, because maybe you're using it for different purposes. I think some of the other issues with having battery-powered vehicles is that it's going to be a huge strain on the electric grid. And so what does that mean when you've got millions of electric vehicles that are coming online by 2030? What does that mean in terms of peak hour demand for the electrical grids and stuff? And I'm actually really curious to hear what the fellow before us was talking about when it comes to grid scale storage, because I think that's going to be an incredibly important technology that we need to figure out a way to develop and make commercializable. That's going to have a huge impact when we're thinking about taking transportation and the electrical grid and being able to integrate both in a way that is sustainable. So that's kind of all the issues with battery-powered vehicles. But then as you look towards electrifying rail, electrifying, you said eVTOL, right? When you think about electric aircraft, why hasn't those taken off? Well, maybe it's because batteries aren't the right solutions to power those systems. And so I'm really encouraged by a lot of the advancements in hydrogen. especially when it comes to long-range modes of transportation. Or you can even think of, when it comes to rail, you can also think of different kinds of catenary electrical systems that aren't battery powered, but rather you have a third rail along the line, kind of like what a lot of European systems do. So there are a lot of different ways in which this is happening. I think there's a lot of really interesting technical advancements in this, and we're right now exploring opportunities to invest in all of those.
Now, I know, Sid, at your location, you are putting in batteries right now, which will make you always at least neutral, if not always positive, 24/7 to the grid. Tell us about that and how, and I'm not leaving because I'm bored with you, I'm going to do questions, but tell us about how that's going to work at the 150 megawatt level, and then I want you to weigh in on bigger numbers and how we're going to make renewable energy big enough to power what you do. But first of all, how are you going to do it?
Well,
can you just plug those EVs, all those electric vehicles, into your grid and use that as storage, maybe?
Well, all the above. So we right now have 10 megawatts of lithium ion batteries that actually was the very first solar to battery facility, I think, in the world. That quickly was eclipsed because they're doing it all over. But as was discussed earlier, lithium ion is not necessarily the right battery, if you will, for grid storage. We need to have significantly more storage in order to to get off the grid, and that's something that is a goal of ours. We want to get there. We'd like to be off the grid and be that first microgrid city, if you will, in the world if we can. We're working with some local utilities, but the battery technologies are changing so fast. It's really hard to bet on one. So that's something that we're focused on. And the other thing is we talk about electric vehicles, and everyone knows the Ford F-150, the Lightning, which now has the technology to put the power back into your house. This is great technology. I mean, you can, depending upon the usage that you have in your home, you could literally power your house for 3 days. An average sized home, 2,500 square foot home, depending on how much air conditioning and so forth. But think about that, because that could have a huge impact on how we think about not just battery storage within the grid, but in your home. And these facilities and these types of capabilities, many companies are doing it, Tesla and others, and we actually have some of those that we're testing. Again, it's great to measure at Babcock, and hope to see more of that as time goes on.
Well, so maybe we need to be thinking about energy in a more distributed way anyway. Instead, it's not unlike the transition on computers from mainframes to laptops. If everybody sort of has their own power plant and storage at home, maybe that solves a lot of the problem. But that doesn't help Bob, who's trying to make plastics for everybody, and that is an energy-hungry business. You're the kind of guy who runs the math. How much renewable energy, what's the delta between what we have and what you need to truly make your products without burning fossil fuels?
Yeah, for our industry, I mean, I'll start with sort of dollar figures, right? If you think about what it would take to go to fully renewable, right? And there are lots of numbers quoted out there, but you're talking about converting society in tens of trillions of dollars, right? So this is a huge investment that has to happen. I think we all have to recognize, and to your point about California, none of this happens unless we invest in the renewable energy infrastructure, but this is going to take decades because of the scale of that, just the physical materials and conversion to make that happen. But as an industry, I think we all play a part in making this happen. And so from our side, the way you start this process is to commit to the offtake, right? You commit to purchasing electricity, which allows the production to happen, allows the regulatory work on the grid capacity expansion that's needed. So I'll take an example for us in Spain, where we produce polycarbonate. We've announced that it'll be fully based on renewable power as of next year. If you look at what's happening even in Saudi Arabia, which I think maybe people say, well, why would they be focused on renewables? Well, they've committed that electricity will be 50% renewable by 2030. So again, and that's because we're engaging and saying we're going to be an off-taker of that. We've committed to go, by over the next decade, to go up to 4 gigawatts and then up to 12 gigawatts of renewable power to help drive our reactions, our conversions. So part of it is making the commitment, right? Building the economics around how you're gonna afford that offtake and the long-term supply offtake that you're gonna manage. But that's what drives the investment, right? This is not something that just magically happens because governments say we need renewable energy, right? The purchasers of it have to commit. Our industry is fully committed to doing that, and it's not just SABIC, it's obviously our peer group companies as well. But you have to take those steps to drive the discussion with the regulators, to make sure that the investment's happening, to make sure that the grid expansion is happening, to manage it. Because this is going to be an extremely complex journey to take. The reality is, and I'll use an example in Europe. I mean, it used to be that when you talk about expanding the grid capacity in Europe, that it would take 10 years to get an approval to expand the grid capacity. So just think about it. If your decision is you want to go expand renewable energy supply for all these EV vehicles that have been produced, can you afford to wait for one approval, to take 10 years? I mean, we have to think about the problem in a very different way.
Yeah, we'll all be cooked by then. All right, question.
Okay. So we talked about disposal of plastics, but what about disposals of batteries, right? We're talking about EV vehicles, and we're thinking that that's the future, but we have a lot of batteries then, like 2 million batteries after like 10 years. Where are we going to dispose of them, I guess, as the technology is today?
Yeah, recycling of lithium ion batteries is a bit of a problem, isn't it? Anybody want that?
I can get started on that. So we've been looking at a couple of really interesting companies that are in that space, that are looking at how do you take these batteries that are going to be coming offline from EVs and repurposing them somehow back into the ecosystem. And as it turns out, there are definitely challenges with that. But there's a way in which you can take a lot of these EVs and these storage components and repackage them into stationary battery grids that you can use then to feed electricity back into the grid, or use it as a distributed energy resource in the future. We've also seen some companies that will literally take those lithium-ion batteries, take them apart, and take those components and recycle the raw materials, because the raw materials make up something like 80% of the cost of a battery cell. And so there are a lot of creative ways in which different companies, different individuals are thinking about doing this right now. But I agree with you. I think that is going to be a big issue in a couple of years when you see more and more of these EVs kind of coming off the market, understanding what is that secondary market going to look like. How do you recycle? How do you repurpose a lot of these batteries is going to be key.
I would think, Sid, you would take an 80% Tesla battery and use it for storage. It'd be fine, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and in fact, the battery storage that we have, the 10 megawatts, is from recycled batteries, lithium-ion batteries.
So they do have life beyond the vehicle usage, which is worth remembering. That said, there's a lot of stuff in a lithium-ion battery. It's not as simple as recycling a lead-acid battery, for sure. But I suspect as time goes on, it's one of those chicken and egg stories. As there's more and more demand and need for it, that somebody will come to market, as you're finding out. Question here.
Hi, so I'm coming from a Boston perspective. Really glad to hear about all the work you're doing in sustainability and communities. Now, one of the things I think about when I think about your, specifically say your sustainable community is there's a lot of talk about home ownership and it being outsourced. I specifically am like living in a rented property, and then a lot of times in Boston, the properties that me and my friends will exist in are owned by corporations. And so when it comes to sustainability, I feel like a lot of people are, the density is positive. You're in one building, you're using like less electricity per person, per family, et cetera. But then sometimes people aren't as invested in those same communities and properties because they don't have the same stake in it. Secondly, we're talking a lot about energy usage, specifically on electric vehicles and how we commute, because transportation is such a big energy cost. One of the benefits to me living in Boston is that I'm able to bike to my workplace, to friends, to family, to groceries, et cetera. And so how are you thinking about density in the creation of this community or others like it as a reduction in energy costs rather than a transfer from fossil fuels to electricity? So those are my two questions. Thank you so much.
Let me answer the second one first, if I could, because if you come to our town at 3 o'clock and you want to see when school lets out, there are literally hundreds of bicycles in front of the school. And when the bell goes off, these kids come out and they've got their fishing poles and they're going to the playgrounds, they're going home, but they're riding their bikes. It's not, and yes, we have parents that come in and have to pick them up, but what we've done at Babcock is made it convenient and easy for people to ride their bikes and to walk and to hike and to bike and to do those things, anything, but even to step out of their electric vehicles. And so that's about design and placemaking, and you can do that up front to make that convenient. You talked about really you're talking about single-family rentals and what these investors are doing. We decided to take that into our own hands at Babcock, and we ourselves, my company, is building our own 250-unit single-family rental community, so we can control ourselves that carbon footprint that's coming out of those homes, the rents. We actually are going to set aside a number of these homes for our teachers so they can afford to be there, because affordability, even at Babcock Ranch, which, in the very beginning, we had teachers, police, all the folks you would expect to be living there. Well, guess what? That's changing rapidly for a number of reasons, inflation, the costs and all the things that go into that, supply chain issues and everything else. But we want to control that. And that's part of that process that we're talking about, to be able to, instead of outsourcing it, we're doing it ourselves.
All right, Sid, for a moment there, it sounded like you were talking about Mayberry RFD there with the fishing pole and the bike, but I think that's good. Anyway, thank you so much, Sid and Bob and Diana. I appreciate the conversation. We certainly could go on this one. What a day we've had. That's it for the Meet the Innovators Day here at the 2022 Edison Awards. The exhibit area is open for another half hour or so. You're invited to go check that out if you haven't. And otherwise, we'll hopefully see you tonight for the big award event. Thank you so much for your attention and participating. Great job. Great. Enjoyed it.